It was supposed to be a miracle. A tiny newborn girl, wrapped in pink blankets, fighting to survive inside a Nashville hospital room. Machines hummed softly, nurses whispered. A young mother leaned over the crib, watching every breath. And then the breathing stopped. Just hours later, that same mother was kneeling beside the hospital bed, performing CPR on her own child. Doctors called it tragic, unimaginable, a medical crisis no one could have prevented. But when it happened again, and again, and again, people started to ask a question no one wanted to say out loud. Was this mother desperately unlucky? Or was she the only one in the room when every child stopped breathing? This is the story of Nancy Guthrie and the deaths that shattered a community and divided a nation. In 2002, in Nashville, Tennessee, Nancy and her husband, Dennis Guthrie, were young parents with everything ahead of them. Nancy was 29, a devoted churchgoer, soft-spoken, educated. She had once dreamed of becoming a pediatric nurse. Friends described her as warm and attentive, the kind of woman who volunteered to babysit and brought casseroles when someone was sick. That year, she gave birth to her second child, a baby girl named Kayla. Kayla was born with a rare metabolic disorder called glutaric acidemia type I, a genetic condition that can cause brain damage if untreated. It was frightening, but not necessarily fatal. Doctors believed with careful monitoring, Kayla could live. Nancy took that responsibility seriously. She was by her daughter's side constantly, at the hospital, at home, through every test and procedure. But by the end of the year, Kayla would be dead. And she wouldn't be the first child Nancy had lost. It started quietly. In early 2001, Nancy and Dennis welcomed their first daughter, Annabelle. She was born healthy, strong lungs, good weight, no major complications. But a few months in, something strange began happening. Nancy would report that Annabelle had stopped breathing. Paramedics were called more than once. The baby would be rushed to the hospital, revived, stabilized. Doctors were puzzled. There were no clear signs of disease, no infections, no structural abnormalities. Nancy was always the one who found her. Always the one performing CPR. Always the only adult in the room when Annabelle collapsed. On September 3, 2001, Annabelle died. The official cause was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The Guthries were devastated. Their church community rallied around them. Meals were delivered, prayers were offered. Nancy wept publicly and privately. No one suspected anything sinister. Losing a child to SIDS is a nightmare no parent chooses. But behind hospital doors, some doctors felt uneasy. They had noticed that Annabelle's breathing episodes only happened when Nancy was alone with her. Still, suspicion is not proof. And grief is not a crime. Just a year later, in 2002, Kayla was born. This time, there was no SIDS mystery. Kayla's metabolic disorder meant doctors were watching closely. She spent extended time in the hospital, monitors attached, nurses present, physicians alert. And yet, somehow, the breathing crises returned. Kayla would suddenly crash. Her oxygen levels would plummet, her heart would slow. Each time, Nancy was the one who alerted staff. "I found her not breathing," she would say. Again and again. Doctors began noticing a pattern. When nurses were in the room, Kayla was stable. When Nancy was alone with her, something happened. But no one could prove what. On July 26, 2002, Kayla died. Official cause: complications from her metabolic disorder. 2 children. 2 deaths. 1 mother. Still no charges. Then came the turning point. Months after Kayla's death, hospital staff began quietly comparing notes. Pediatric specialists who had treated both girls realized the similarities were too strong to ignore. Both children had unexplained breathing collapses. Both events happened when Nancy was alone with them. Both showed signs of oxygen deprivation inconsistent with their diagnoses. And perhaps most troubling, Nancy often appeared calm. Not hysterical, not frantic. Controlled. Composed. One doctor later said it felt like the child's crises were being staged. The suspicion shifted from tragic coincidence to possible suffocation. The Nashville police were notified. Investigators reviewed hospital records, paramedic reports, autopsy findings. They interviewed nurses. Several staff members admitted they had felt uncomfortable but hadn't known how to voice it. Accusing a grieving mother of harming her own child is not something anyone does lightly. There was no surveillance footage inside private hospital rooms. No eyewitness. No confession. But forensic reviews suggested that Kayla's death did not fully align with her medical condition. Her metabolic disorder could explain long-term damage, but not the acute respiratory shutdown she experienced. Detectives also learned that Nancy had researched pediatric medical conditions extensively. She knew how monitors worked. She knew how to trigger alarms. And she knew how to revive a child convincingly. Still, it was a circumstantial case, until prosecutors made a decision that shocked the community. They charged Nancy Guthrie with first-degree murder in Kayla's death. The theory: she had intentionally suffocated her daughter while alone in the hospital room. The motive: that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. In 2003, Nancy Guthrie stood trial in Tennessee. She appeared composed, soft-spoken, wearing conservative clothing. Her husband stood by her side. The prosecution argued that Nancy suffered from a form of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now called factitious disorder imposed on another. They claimed she created medical crises to gain attention, sympathy, and a sense of control. Doctors testified about the patterns. Nurses described their discomfort. Prosecutors emphasized that both girls' breathing episodes only occurred when Nancy was alone with them. The defense pushed back hard. They argued Kayla's metabolic disorder explained everything. They reminded jurors that Annabelle's death had been ruled SIDS. They pointed out the complete lack of direct evidence. No one saw Nancy suffocate her child. There were no bruises, no clear physical signs of forced smothering. The case relied heavily on inference. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: not guilty. Nancy Guthrie walked free. For some, the verdict was justice. For others, it felt like a failure of the system. Years later, Nancy would give interviews defending herself. She insisted she had loved her daughters and had done everything possible to save them. She even became involved in SIDS awareness efforts, speaking publicly about the pain of losing children. But many medical professionals remained unsettled. Because statistically, 2 unexplained infant deaths in one family, especially with similar patterns, are extremely rare. Some investigators privately maintained their suspicions. But double jeopardy meant Nancy could not be retried for Kayla's death. The case remains officially unresolved in the eyes of public opinion. If Nancy Guthrie was innocent, then she endured the unthinkable, the loss of 2 children and the weight of public suspicion. But if the prosecution's theory was correct, then the case represents one of the most disturbing forms of abuse: a parent fabricating or inducing illness for emotional gratification. Factitious disorder imposed on another is complex. It often involves a caregiver seeking validation through medical attention. The child becomes a vessel for sympathy. In hospital settings, these cases are notoriously difficult to prove. Caregivers often appear attentive and devoted, medical staff hesitate to suspect harm. The Guthrie case forced hospitals to confront uncomfortable realities about monitoring and documentation. It also revealed how thin the line can be between tragedy and crime. Because sometimes the most dangerous place for a child isn't a dark alley. It's a hospital room, with the door closed, and only one person inside. 2 baby girls lost their lives before they ever had a chance to live. A mother was tried for murder and walked away. And somewhere between grief and suspicion, the truth remains buried in silence. Because when a child stops breathing and the only witness is the person sworn to protect them, how do you ever know what really happened?